Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everyone, to our 150th episode. Hard to believe, 150 episodes in, really cool. And I want to thank all of you for your support. I really just want to say thank you. Thank you for listening every week. Thank you for all the kind words, all the 5-star reviews, for spreading the word on social media, for letting your chess playing friends know about the pod. Really appreciate it. And so 200 episodes, here we come. I do have a few production notes just about the podcast and some content creation things, but I'm going to save those for the end. Some people really aren't into that and just kind of want to hear the chess content. Other people like hearing about that stuff. So I'll save it again for the end, and then you can decide if you want to bag out of the episode early or stick around and listen to that. So let's begin, as always, with our listener mailbag.
You've got mail.
Our first message is from Marty. He says, hello, love your show. Wanted to comment on the stats you presented in episode 149 regarding the percentages of games played on chess.com with different time controls. I believe that the statistics are biased by the default time controls that are listed when you log into chess.com. For example, there is a 10:0 time control, but no 10:5 time control. A player can, of course, set up a time control, but if one sets up a 10:5 time control, there won't be as many people who are playing with that time control, and this is supported by the statistics. The sum of the statistics you provided for 10:0, 3:0, 1:0, and 5:0 is about 85%, including 3-2, this is 90%. So less than 10% of games have a 10:5 time control. Compare the default home screen for chess.com to lichess.org. Lichess has many more options. I'm sure these statistics are different for lichess.org simply because of what is available in the home screen. Well, that's a very good point, Marty. Of course, the more default time controls they show, the less friction there is. Like for many people, if they want a specific time control, like I like 5-5, you actually have to manually input that. And again, that extra step, that friction, a lot of people aren't going to bother with that. So I did take a look, and yes, lichess.org does have many more choices in their default table of time controls that you can just click on directly. So that's a very good point. And for those of you who missed last week's show, I was referring to an article on chess.com. It's linked up in last week's episode where they were discussing chess.com was discussing the most common time controls on their site and how the games end. It was kind of an interesting commentary. I was giving that a look or really analyzing it from a chess improvement point of view. But Marty, I agree with you completely. The way that it's presented, the packaging, so to speak, will certainly affect those statistics. So I appreciate your email. Thank you. Next up, we have a message from Alex. He says, hi, Neil. Thanks for the great podcast. I've started listening in the last week, and I'm enjoying catching up on the backlog. I'm writing with some debate about your ruling regarding whether or not to answer a player's question about castling in episode 149. The player asked, can I castle here? Is it legal if I castle? Your ruling was not to provide the player information. The rationale was that doing so would constitute giving advice. Under U.S. CF Rule 20E, players are forbidden to make use of a device, solicited or not. So it does make sense to take a conservative approach and stay well clear of any advice. But I would argue that providing the player with a clarification on the rules of legal castling does not constitute advice. Under Rule 21D1, answering rules and procedural questions is squarely within the tournament director's duties and powers when asked to intervene in a game. Imagine an oddly specific player question. Honorable Tournament Director, could you remind me of the contents of Rule 8C1 regarding restrictions that apply to the king but not the rook when castling? And imagine you read to them the rule from the book verbatim. This is plainly allowed, in my opinion, as just answering a rules question, not advice. Back to your situation, I think you could have replied to the player with any or all information in Rules 8A2, 3, 4, and 8C1, either in plain language or read from the book, and it would not be advice, but it would make obvious to both players that castling was a legal move. Just some thoughts from a guy with a rule book, not an experienced TD. Would love to hear if you've thought more about this one. Alex in Louisville, Kentucky. Well, thanks, Alex, for the comment. I appreciate it. I do stand by the ruling that I made because he was really asking about a specific move in a specific instance, not a generic rules question. Like if he had just asked me, again, generically about the rules for castling, that's one thing. But his question was, can I castle here in this position? And if I answer him, it's almost like I'm helping him read the position. So I stand by what I said. Now, I'm not saying that my ruling is correct and the only correct answer. Another TD might disagree, but you were talking about how I would provide information and not a ruling. But again, this was more than answering a procedural question. This was about a specific move in a specific position. So maybe if I say, well, yes, castling's legal here, that's going to make him notice his opponent's bishop or something that he may not have. Again, it's a tightrope here. It's a tricky situation, but I just felt that if I had told him, yes, you can play this specific move in this specific position, that's more on the side of giving advice. And here's the thing. It's the player's responsibility to know the rules and if something is legal or not. You know, they don't get a free pass. Remember, this is a tournament game. It's a rated game. They don't get a free pass just because they don't have the experience. Now, that may sound a little harsh, but you have to remember, you got to be careful because, again, where is the line from simply reviewing a procedural rule that they have a question on and giving advice? So I erred on the side of caution, and I basically said, I stand by what I said. I said, you have to make what you think is the best move here. And again, I stand by what I said. I thought that it would have been helping him a little too much. It's a tricky thing, Alex, and I'm sure many TDs will agree with you. It's one of those situations where it's kind of a judgment call by the TD. But thanks for the comment, Alex. I really appreciate it. And now we're going to get into our main content. We're going to talk about the Jobava London system, which is basically a variation on the traditional London formation. It's a fantastic opening. And what I would like to do first, just to kind of keep this organized, I want to review the London system in general, the mainline London system. Let's talk about that. Let's review that. And then we'll get into the Jobava variation and talk about some of the advantages and the ideas that you can use. Now, what I'm going to do, I will link up the episode I did previously on the London system in case you didn't hear it. If you didn't hear that one first, that's fine. You can listen at a sequence. But let's just kind of go over some basics for the uninitiated. So the London system and the Jobava London variation are, of course, system openings. So let's understand what a system opening is so we have our terms straight. A system opening is an opening where you're more concerned about achieving a certain formation, a certain arrangement of your pieces, a certain structure, rather than individual moves. See, with most, let's say, E4, E5 openings, like most symmetrical openings, which I'm not a fan of, you know that, they're very move order dependent. So a lot of these E4, E5 systems, it's basically, okay, white moves, black moves, and then white moves, okay, and then whatever black moves now, like as white, you have to make a certain move or you're already losing. Or as black, if white makes a certain move, you only have one, maybe two responses that maintain the position, otherwise you're losing. So there's a lot of theory. When we say theory, we really mean like memorized moves. Like if he goes here, you have to do this, right? If he does this, you have to do that or you're losing. And many of these E4, E5 openings, again, they're move order dependent. It's a lot of memorization. And if you make just one misstep, again, you're already losing. With a system opening, because you're aiming for certain pieces to end up on certain squares, there's a little bit more flexibility in the move order. In other words, how you get there often doesn't matter. Now, of course, even with system openings, there's some theory, but certainly not as much as some of the E4, E5 systems. So again, with a system opening, you want to end up with a formation where certain pieces end up on certain squares. That's a system opening in its most basic definition. And again, the beauty of that, the move order doesn't have to necessarily be very prescriptive. There is some flexibility. You can kind of move out of sequence, and as long as you end up with the structure that you want, that you're aiming for, you're good to go. Now, one of the major benefits of system openings for busy adults is that they're easy to learn and there's not a lot of theory. So you don't have to spend hours memorizing lines. Once you understand the structure and where your pieces go, you can start playing it. You'll learn a little bit of the nuances, but with system openings, you can kind of jump in right away. I mean, when I was teaching beginners and we were talking about openings, I mean, you could teach the basics of the London system in one lesson. You could basically give one lesson on the London system and they can start playing it in their games with a reasonable amount of competence. Now, of course, the more they play it, the more they're going to learn. They're going to learn the basic structures and the basic themes and ideas, but you can pretty much start playing it right away. And of course, as busy adults, we don't have time to spend hours and hours studying theory. So system openings are great if you're busy. Now, of course, the standard London system formation, which most of you are familiar with, we open with D4, and then we get that pawn triangle in the middle with the pawns on E3 and C3. So C3, D4, and E3, that's your main pawn triangle. Now, before that, the bishop goes to F4. Usually it's D4, then bishop F4 right away, and then you lock it in with E3. You want to get the dark squared bishop outside the pawn chain. So again, the bishop is on F4. You have your pawns on C3, D4, and E3. Your knight goes to F3. The bishop generally goes to D3, the light squared bishop, but it could go to E2. You will generally castle kingside, although sometimes you might hold off on castling. And usually the queenside knight goes to D2. We go knight B, D2. Now, of course, there are some lines where instead of playing C3, you will move the C pawn to C4, and then you'll go knight C3 behind the pawn. The knight sits really nicely behind the pawn there. If you're usually, and again, we're speaking in very basic terms here, usually if black holds off on D5, if he plays like a King's Indian type of setup, you can play for C4 right away instead of C3. I mean, if black will let you get in C4, usually you do it, but that's another idea, C4 and then knight C3. I usually do that, again, against the King's Indian or other systems where black holds back D5. But that's the main structure. And remember, the London is really more about central control than central expansion. Very often you get that lock in the center, and then you can attack on the king side. Now, another main idea in the London, and this is also true for the Jobava, is the knight on F3 then hops to E5, right? You want to get that knight on E5. You generally want to prevent black from getting in E5 with his pawn. So that's the basic structure of the London system. And remember, we are audio only here, so I don't want to start to get into like specific lines and blindfold chess. I just kind of want to give you the main schematic, so to speak. Now, as far as standard plans in the London, again, it's more about central control than expansion. So one idea is to attack the king side. You attack black's castled king. Again, the knight's going to jump to E5. You cement it there. This is where you can also get in H4 ideas, things like that. Although you can attack the king without having to move, the H pawn, because the bishop on D3 is attacking there. It really depends on the specific position. White generally castles kingside, but he could castle queenside. It really depends. Now, if you don't do a kingside attack, you can also play on the queen side. I've had many games that I've won where I'll get a positional advantage on the queen side. I'll convert that into a winning endgame and just go on from there to sort of grind down my opponent. So very often the C7 square for black becomes a weakness because the bishop on F4 is hitting it. If you can open up the C file, because that's one way to play the London, you play for the C file and queenside play and get an advantage there. So the London doesn't always have to be this crazy attacking system. It can also be a more quiet and solid and positional system. And of course, a lot of how you proceed after the initial structure is set up is really going to depend on how black plays. Now, we spoke about central control rather than expanding in the center, but central play can certainly happen with ideas based on E4 or C4. Now, usually with the standard London, white's not going to get in E4 right away. In the Jobava, it's a little bit different. Depending on how black plays, you can play for an E4 idea as white, or very often C4. C4 is probably going to come first. With the standard London, you can play C4 right away and then go knight C3, although the standard formation is C3 and knight BD2. So there's some wiggle room there. We're now going to take a short break, and then we will jump into the Jobava variation. All right, so let's talk about the Jobava. So this is a variation of the London system where instead of D4, bishop F4, E3, all those types of moves, what you do is your queenside knight goes to C3. So basically, the opening moves for the Jobava would be D4, knight C3, and then bishop F4. You could go D4, bishop F4, and then knight C3. Doesn't really matter. Usually I play knight C3 first, but that's the idea with the Jobava. And the whole thing is, with that knight on C3, the two main threats, which we'll talk about in a moment, are to play for E4, so you have the two pawns in the center, or the knight hop to B5, where along with your bishop on F4, you're threatening knight takes C7, winning a pawn, or if he moves the pawn, you're forking the rook on A8 and the king. All right, so D4, knight C3, bishop F4. Those are the main moves of the Jobava, and then we'll take it a little bit further in a moment. So you're not going to play C3 and knight BD2 the way you would in a mainline London. Now, most of the information in this episode I'm referencing from the book The Jobava London System by Simon Williams. It's excellent. I'll link it up in the show notes. GM Simon Williams, right, the Ginger GM, probably the most popular or most well-known teacher of the Jobava system, or the biggest proponent of the Jobava system. He has some chessable stuff on it. He has this book, and it even says on the cover of this book that it's based largely on the chessable course he has, but we're going to be using this book. It's excellent. I started reading through it. I looked at some of the variations. I'm now motivated to kind of read the whole thing. A lot of this episode is going to be a review of this book. This will be kind of like the Jobava in general, and also a review of this book, which is fine. And I want to read from the introduction of this book on page 5, because the way he presents it, it's very, very well said. So here it is. He says, "Welcome to the wonderful world of the Jobava London system. A simple yet effective opening, an opening that is young in its life but has a great future. I came across this opening when watching the games of GM Badur Jobava. My first thought was, what is this opening? Why haven't I seen it before? The more I researched it, the more I thought it would be a perfect opening for numerous players. What are the benefits of the Jobava London? Number 1, it is a perfect opening for people who have little time on their hands. This is because the ideas and moves are simple to learn. There is very little theory as such, and so long as you master the main ideas and concepts, the Jobava London system will offer you lots of fun and exciting games. Compared to other openings where mountains of variations need to be learned, this makes it an attractive opening. In essence, it is very simple, yet very powerful. Number 2, the opening hasn't been around for long. It is definitely fresh and fun. The Jobava London has only really started to gain momentum at the top level in the last 10 years, so in terms of openings, it is a youngster. This means there are areas of it that are still to be explored. Number 3, it is perfect for beginners, juniors, people with bad memories, and experts alike. As I have mentioned, the Jobava London's starting moves are very easy to learn. There are not many long lines, which also make it attractive to those of us who do not want to just rely on our memories, but instead want to be creative. Number 4, Black cannot play on autopilot. Many players on the black side might have learned what to do against standard white d4 openings, but the Jobava London is different. This means that it will surprise black at an early stage, which cannot be a bad thing. Convinced yet? Possibly not. Well, let me show you some moves. And then he goes on from there. I think that intro is very well said. It's great if you don't have a lot of time, which is kind of what this podcast is all about, right? Chess improvement for busy adults with other responsibilities. It's easy to learn. Now, what I like about the Jobava, it basically mixes it up a little bit without you having to learn an entirely different opening. So if you're known as a London player, which I am, and I'm playing someone who I know likes to prepare, I might break out the Jobava instead, and that does a couple of things. Psychologically, it might throw them off because they didn't prepare for it. It's something new. And I like the fact with the Jobava that you kind of don't know where it's going to go. It's almost like you're jumping off a cliff and worrying about how you're going to land later. But it's a good way to stay within the London ecosystem, but yet still mix it up enough. So I've been experimenting with this at the club when I play. I've been playing a lot of online games. It's funny though, I notice when I play online, I mean, even over the board, a lot of people are catching on. For example, after d4, knight c3, a lot of my opponents are playing a6 immediately, right? Because they want to prevent that knight to b5. It's almost like they're saying, yeah, you're not fooling anybody. We know what the Jobava is. You're going to try to go knight b5 and hit c7. So they just play a6 right away. But then, of course, you can look to maybe play for e4. People are catching on to it, but even if they're aware of that knight b5 hop, I still think you can kind of mix up the position a little bit. So if you're playing someone who's booked up against the traditional mainline London, this is a great variation. And like I said, if you're really a diehard London player, it's not like you're learning a completely different opening. You're just adding this little twist to it. So chapter 1 of this book is called Common Ideas for White, and it explains the main themes with the opening, and that's what I want to discuss now. I might add a few ideas of my own, but again, this is all from the book, The Jobava London System by GM Simon Williams. So the first idea, which I've already mentioned a few times already, is the knight hop to b5. So remember, the main three moves, or the first three moves of the Jobava, are d4, knight c3, and bishop f4. And the idea with knight b5, again, is that you're hitting c7. You're threatening a fork. If black misses it, very often to defend, if he misses knight b5, he's going to have to play knight a6, putting the knight on the edge of the board in a very odd square. And even if that defends it, the thing is the knight on a6 is misplaced. So you already have a bit of a positional advantage on the queen side. And then, of course, after the knight moves to b5, you then need to look to play c3 at some point because you want to prevent his knight from a6 from hopping to b4 at some point. Right now, it's not going to do that because it's defending c7, but that's an idea. Now, what Simon Williams mentions in the book, for the knight b5 idea to work at its best, you generally want to wait until after black moves the c-pawn, because then defending against c7 is much harder. So the reason is, if you go knight b5 and black hasn't moved his c-pawn yet, he can kick it away with c6. So what he says in the book early on is that the knight b5 idea works better after the c-pawn has been moved. But that's one of the main threats with the Jobava. Okay, the knight to b5 in combination with the bishop on f4, hitting c7. The next thing he talks about is domination of the dark squares with this variation, and I'll just read his introductory paragraph to that. He says, you will often find yourself trying to dominate the dark squares in the center of the board, especially d4 and c5. This can be done with pawns or with pieces. Piece domination of these squares works especially well after the sequence c5 by black, d takes c5, when the d4 square is free for a white piece to jump into. It works even better when both dark squared bishops have already been exchanged. There are many examples of this, and then he gives us an instructive game showing that. The next idea is an attacking one, which is playing h4 against g6 setups by black. So if black does a King's Indian type of setup, where he has his pawns on g6, f7, and h7, as Simon Williams would say, here comes Harry. I love when he does that. The h-pawn, here comes Harry. And the reason the h4 push is effective against the King's Indian type of setup is because when black fiend kettles on the king side, when he plays g6, technically you're weakening your king side pawn structure because that g6 pawn can be vulnerable. You can kind of chip away at it. Whereas if you go h4 and his castling pawns are in their original position, well, white's h pawn has to go a little bit further. And also, if the dark squared bishops are exchanged, those dark squares by his king, like f6, g7, and h6, can be weak. So the h4 idea in the Jobava is really most effective with those g6 type of systems that black plays. But that's a major theme in the Jobava. The next theme, and this is true for the mainline London as well, is that white's knight on f3 jumps to e5. That knight sort of cements itself on e5, and then that can lead to an attack on the king side. So the knight goes to e5, white has firm control of the center, and then that can become an attacking piece against the king. So you could have, say, the knight on e5 in combination with an h4, h5 idea, and against those g6 systems especially, this can be very effective. But the idea of the knight hop from g1 to f3 to e5, that's a London thing even in the main line. So the main line, the Jobava, the knight e5 idea by white, that's a major, major positional and attacking idea in this system. The next theme he mentions with the Jobava is an interesting one. It's the capture on c5. And here's what he says. In some cases, we should seriously consider capturing a black pawn if it has moved to c5. This is not always a good option, but it becomes much stronger when black has already played a6. Here's a game I played at one of my favorite tournaments that demonstrates this concept, and he shows the game. Because usually in the mainline London, white generally doesn't capture on c5 because you're kind of exchanging your center pawn for a wing pawn. I mean, there are some lines where it does make sense, actually. Like some people feel you should never capture on c5. That's not true. But it's interesting that he's saying in the Jobava that capture can be important. Now, one of the things he talks about is after d takes c5, and if black has played a6, the b6 square is weak and is covered by white's pawn on c5. So an idea for white would be to go knight c3 to a4 to b6, which is supported by that pawn. And of course, a knight on the 6th rank that can't be kicked away is brutal. That's probably the most important square for a knight, or the most powerful square for a knight, because if you're on the 6th rank, you're attacking so many squares in your opponent's camp. And if it's an outpost, if that knight can't be kicked away, that can be brutal, right? And there's a theory that a knight firmly planted on the 6th rank is as valuable or more valuable than a rook. And very often the defending player will have to sacrifice a rook because that knight is so powerful, they'll have to give up the exchange. So the whole capture on c5 is an interesting idea. That's something with the Jobava I hadn't thought about much or wasn't aware of until I looked at it in this book. So very interesting. The next theme is the idea of playing f3 as white when black plays bishop f5. So a common idea is, of course, white plays bishop f4, and then black will play bishop f5, like a symmetrical type thing with his light squared bishop. And an idea is that you can play f3, not so much with the idea of trying to get an e4, but you go f3 and then g4. Remember, this f3 idea is when black has a bishop on f5. So white goes f3 and then g4 with a kingside pawn storm, and then you're attacking the bishop on f5. And then, of course, after f3 and g4, you can then push with h4. And he has a whole section on that. That can be a great attacking idea. It can be a great way to sort of get out of a traditional London setup against somebody who's booked up. If you're playing a very timid positional player, that might drive them crazy. Very, very cool idea, a little nuance there. Now, one thing I want to add, and I'm sure he mentions this in the book somewhere. Again, I didn't read this book from cover to cover. I looked at the intro, of course, and just some sections throughout. I kind of browsed through it. Of course, now I'm kind of pumped up to look at the whole thing. But one idea with the London that I've used is that because you're going knight c3, the d2 square is free for the queen, right? Because normally you go c3 and knight bd2. But after knight c3, and remember the dark squared bishop is on f4 already, you can play queen d2. And what happens is when you play queen d2 as white, you're on the same diagonal as the dark squared bishop. So your bishop and queen form a battery on the c1, h6 diagonal. And the idea is that you can then play for e4, which opens up the queen. And against a g6 type setup, a King's Indian type setup that black has, that can be very effective because you're hitting h6. You could maybe exchange dark squared bishops, weaken his king side, or you could just keep the queen and bishop on that diagonal and then continue with the h4 idea. So again, against g6 systems, this is probably most effective. So you have the queen on d2, the bishop on f4, you play for e4 so that your queen is opened up as well, and then you combine that with the h4 idea, right? And then of course, if you have a knight on e5 as well. So that's something that I've done, and you can really get a monster position and a really crazy attack that way. So that's something interesting that I play for. And just to give you an idea of the remaining parts of the book, let me kind of go through the contents from the beginning. So he has an introduction, then he has common ideas for white, which we kind of just discussed. Then he has a section called Quick Starter, which kind of allows you to look at some games and jump right in. And then he divides it into 3 parts, which of course, as with most opening books, these are organized according to black's various defensive setups. All right, so part 1 are the main lines: d4, knight f6, knight c3, d5, bishop f4. And then he discusses all the different moves that black can play on move 3, like how to respond after c5, bishop f5, c6, e6, or a6. And what he says, a6 on move 3, I've been seeing that a lot. So that's a section I'm definitely going to look at. In part 2, he talks about all of the g6 systems when black fianchettos, does like a King's Indian type of setup where black plays 3g6 or 2g6, a lot of attacking ideas against that fianchettoed position. And then part 3 is what he calls early alternatives, where black kind of deviates early on. He talks about an early e6 and an early bishop b4. He talks about 1c5. He gets into the Dutch. Pretty much any reasonable response or system that black can come up with, he discusses. I will say this, for myself, the way that I defend against the Jobava London, if someone plays it against me, and longtime listeners probably know what I'm going to say, I use a Queen's Indian defense. Works very well. The Queen's Indian is a fantastic setup against the mainline London, and it's also great against the Jobava. Because with the Queen's Indian, you go knight f6, e6, b6, bishop b7, bishop e7, and usually you'll get in d6 at some point. It's almost like a Queen's Indian sort of hedgehog hybrid that I set up. It's not an aggressive system, but it's very solid, and it really doesn't give white much. And then he has to say, okay, well, what am I doing with the knight on c3? So there's no knight b5 ideas. It's very solid. I will sometimes try to get my knight onto e4. As you know, I'm a big fan of that system. So the Queen's Indian, it's just a fantastic defense. Obviously, against the mainline D-pawn openings, you would use a Queen's Indian or a Nimzo Indian, depending on what white plays. But it works great against the London. And that's what I like to do with openings. That's what I'm always advocating. Why learn a new defense if you have something in your repertoire that has a dual purpose? I have to give my opponents credit. Even with that, when they play the Jobava, it's always interesting how the position is going to end up. So those are the basic ideas with the Jobava London. I highly recommend this system, and I'm giving you just the schematic here. I wanted to just give you a basic overview. I wasn't about to rattle off like specific lines and variations. That's going to get way too confusing for audio only. What I'll probably do at some point on our Long Island Chess Club YouTube channel, which I'm still building, it's not where I want it, but I will probably put an actual video talking about the Jobava there at some point. You can pretty much start playing it right away. Try it online in some of your Blitz games. And then if you play OTB, you can give it a shot as well. We're going to take one more short break. And when we come back, I just have some production notes about the show and the podcast itself. If you're interested in hearing that, stick around. If you have zero interest in hearing about that, you're just here purely for the chess content, you can safely log off now, and I hope you win your next game. But for those of you who want to hear that information, stick around. We'll be right back. All right, so a couple of things about the show, for those of you who are still listening. I know that I spoke at the beginning of this season about having a video version for all episodes on YouTube, and I made a mistake. I spoke in absolutes, which I know better. I'm always telling other people don't speak in absolutes, but yet I did it myself. I severely underestimated the workflow to that, even if it is just a talking head video, because on paper in the abstract, it's like, well, what's the big deal? Just do what you normally do and just turn the camera on. But it's much more involved than that as far as editing and the presentation, even if it just is a talking head style. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of split the difference. So at this time, my solo episodes will likely be audio only with just a still image on YouTube. All right. And again, just to be clear, I'm talking about YouTube right now. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, which most people do, like 95% of our audience is audio only, nothing's going to change. But as far as the video version, I know some people like that. My solo episodes are going to be audio only with a still image, but for my guest episodes, I will likely have the video versions, only because in a way I'm kind of forced to, because we usually record on a video platform anyway. Even though it would be easier to present those audio only, I'm going to do my best to keep the guest episodes video versions on YouTube. Will I still have an occasional solo episode that's a video? I hope so. But for now, again, most solo episodes will just be audio only. One other production note, I haven't mentioned this in a while. I'm still in the process of building up our Long Island Chess Club YouTube channel. So to be clear, that's separate from the podcast one. The Chess Angle Podcast YouTube channel is what you're hearing now. That's just the podcast. The Long Island Chess Club YouTube channel, that is a quote unquote true chess channel. Like, it's pure video instruction. There's a chessboard, there's a window of me talking, and that is pure instruction. So if you like this podcast, just picture like an actual YouTube chess video. That's what the Long Island Chess Club channel is. There is a link for it in every episode in the show notes. And it's one of those things, it's like someone who says, yeah, I want to keep writing this book, and I'm not getting that off the ground the way I want to. It's understandable. I can only do so much. And of course, the podcast is my main baby, but I really do want to build that channel. I'm still working up to the point where I would post on there regularly and call it a quote unquote active channel. Now, the Long Island Chess Club YouTube channel, it's there, it's up and running. You can check it out. But again, I would not call it an active channel because I'm not posting nearly as much as I want to. So I'm not there yet. But when I am at the point where I kind of have a momentum going and I'm posting regularly, I will likely have a dedicated episode on this podcast formally introducing the channel. But again, there's really not a lot of videos on there yet. Now you may say, wait a minute, you just said that the video workflow was too much. Yeah, but that's for the podcast, which is very long form content, like 40 minutes or so for a solo episode. Whereas the videos for the Long Island Chess Club channel, they're like 8 to 10 minutes long. I'm doing that deliberately. The Long Island Chess Club channel, I want the videos to be easily consumable for busy adults. So you're not going to see like 40-minute chess videos on there. I want you to be able to look at them, let's say in the morning with breakfast, or, if you're sitting in bed at night, or if you're picking your child up from soccer practice and, you have a few minutes to kill, or if you're on a lunch break or a coffee break at work. Those videos on the Long Island Chess Club channel are like 8 to 10 minutes, maybe closer to 15 at the most, but that sort of 8 to 12 minute range, that's what I'm looking for. In fact, I think those are appropriate for YouTube chess videos because you're not processing too much information at once. It's not going to be one of these 75 chess concepts and it's like a 40-minute video. I don't know if you can really process that, But those videos are directed to the point, and again, they're meant for busy adults. You're not going to see like a 30-minute video on the Long Island Chess Club channel. But anyway, that channel is open for business, so to speak, but I'm not quite there yet as far as the amount of content and the consistency. So I just wanted to share those production notes for those of you who stuck around to listen. I appreciate it. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.